Okay, folks, fourth part, and we're looking at Renaissance, Quattrocento, Italy, and we finished up with Botticelli in the last video, and now I'm going to speak about the architecture of Florence at this time. Finish with that, and then get into Venice a bit, and then also Mantua, and then the next chapter will be into the high and late Renaissance. Okay, so where I want you to begin with this video is figure 21.31, and we're going to look at Brunelleschi. And that name should look familiar because he was the one that was competing with his student Ghiberti. And during this time, towards the end of this Quattrocento, um, Brunelleschi is no longer that interested in sculpture, in casting bronze, this or that, whatever the case might be. He's more interested in architecture, so he devotes the latter part of his life to that of architecture. And the most renounced and most famous of his architecture is San Lorenzo in Florence, 1421 to 1469. So that's how long it took, give or take a few years, a few months, to build San Lorenzo. Brunelleschi. So again, he went to architecture after sculpting, and pretty much after Ghiberti lost to him during that time. Maybe it was something about his student losing to him. I'm not quite sure, but he made a conscious decision to stop sculpting and to focus on architecture. So you should be able to know his name as the Sacrifice of Isaac with the bronze door pieces, as well as his architecture of San Lorenzo. Um, what's really great about San Lorenzo is we have the basilica. It is back. Okay, the diagram can be found. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I don't have the diagram. It doesn't matter. The diagram will be your standard um, basilica. So you'll have your nave in the middle, your aisleways in the side, you'll have your narthex in the front, which is the entrance, and then up towards the apse, which is going to be the top of what will aerially appear like a cross, will be in the top of the cross, and then you'll have your transepts as well. So those will be like the arms of the cross, so to speak. But it's back. So here we see bringing back this basilica-like feature which was in the late Roman Empire. So again, another Greco-Roman inclusion in the Renaissance, and that is now with the architecture of the basilica coming back from Brunelleschi. One thing about San Lorenzo, it's very austere and rational. And it has the nave, it has the arcade. And remember, we're looking at rationality right now, meaning not overly ornamented or any kind of heavy ornamentation, because that was medieval, that was Gothic. And now the architecture is going to become more simplified, more austere, less visually verbose, if you will, less cluttered in eyesight, and more of that rationalism of sight, like what we talked about with linear perspective. And now we're going to see that within the architecture. It has a flat timber roof. So instead of that barrel vault for the nave running down the middle, it's a flat timbered roof, which is what is going to make it austere. Versus the basilicas and the cathedrals during the Gothic period, they have those huge barrel vaults that are the rib vaulted barrels, all of those groin vaulted, rib pointed archways that go all the way down the nave. And in this case, we see the breaks being put on for that kind of ornamentation. And it's very austere, very simple, back to square one kind of rationalism, if you will. So it has a very flat, and you'll see that figure 21.31, that centered timber roof that runs all the way down the nave instead of it being an archway. It's a flat roof. Um, so it does have the Corinthian capitals. So if you look at the pillars and the columns, not pillars, the columns that are running down, creating that arcade. And again, know that that arcade is a series of arches side by side, adjacent to one another, that are creating what's called an arcade. And the capitals, which are the top of the shaft of the column, are called Corinthian orders. That's Corinthian, Corinthian. In that Corinthian order or capital, we call it an order whenever we're talking about the capital on top of a column. There was a Doric, there was an Ionic, and there was a Corinthian during the Greek time. And Brunelleschi wanted to reintroduce or bring back this Corinthian capital or this Corinthian pillar. So he's pulling from the Hellenistic period of Greece. So again, Greco-Roman. They're rounded arch instead of pointed, so the arches are rounded versus, remember, or if you recall in Art History 141, during the Gothic medieval period, the arches were pointed, which lessened the structural integrity of the architecture by them being pointed, which required flying buttresses on the exterior of those cathedrals. Here we've gone back to the barrel vault. We've gone back to the barrel archway or the sprung arch, which is going to create more structural integrity. And plus it gives a more simplified, minimal kind of look, minimalistic kind of look, even though this is not minimalistic by any means. It's very ornate in and of itself, but not to the degree of the Gothic period or the medieval period at that, high medieval. It does have something new called oculi, A-C-U-L-I. Those are eyes, oculi. So oculus, if you remember your Roman art, there is the Pantheon that has an oculus in the center of the hemispherical dome that lights up the interior of the space of the Pantheon. And here there's a series of concentric, or not concentric, but a series of sequential oculi that are running down the nave and illuminating the nave and the aisleways on the way to the apse, A-P-S-E, the apse. And so that's kind of new, and that's Brunelleschi bringing in more light and illuminating. Instead of the big stained glass images that was seen during the Gothic period, they're minimizing that and bringing in small little portals of light called oculi. And again, it's not emotional by any means. It's not emotional. It's very simple. It's rational. It's mathematical. It has structure to it, literally, but also visually it has structure to it. It has a series of symmetry. It has a series of just ease, and it's non-emotional. And that's what we're moving into. So we're moving out of this emotional feeling of biblical worship and praise in the medieval into that same Orthodox Christian narrative, but more rational. We're bringing in more science and rationality into the makeup of the new architecture and paintings and sculptures of this Renaissance time. Okay? So now we're going to move out of Florence, and we're going to move into Venice. All right? And what I want to look at in Venice is one piece in particular, and that's figure 21.40. Now, this chapter is predominantly Florence. You need to know that because that is going to be the main center hub of activity for the Renaissance. Then it's going to shift gears. So a lot of these very prominent artists like Leonardo and Michelangelo, they're going to go to Florence and learn what's going on there, and then they're going to go to other areas. Like Michelangelo is going to become very prominent in Rome, and Leonardo is going to remain in Florence and become very prominent there. Or Venice, I forgot. I believe he's going to stay in Florence. Raphael is going to go into Florence and then go back to Venice and become very prominent. Anyway, I'll talk about that in the next chapter. But Florence is very well addressed in this chapter because there's just so much going on in Florence that's influencing everyone else. So figure 2140, Bellini, St. Francis in the desert. And he was also, Bellini, one of these artists that originally focused on imitation and emulation, but it was his father. He emulated and imitated his father's style of painting, so his father was his master artist that he learned from. And then once he imitated his father's style and emulated it in a series of a whole bunch of work, then he started to create his own style, and that's what we see here. And it began after his father's passing away. So when his father died, Giovanni Bellini, then started taking on his own style and dropped the imitation and the emulation because now it was time for him to move on into his own style, which was very common. But not a father son commonality, more of a master student commonality. Once the master passed away or moved on from making the arts, then the student would start to make his own style and no longer imitate or emulate that master artist. So he again is now one thing that is going to be happening here is, if you recall our discussion on early Renaissance in Europe, which is considered Northern Renaissance, this here in Florence is considered a Southern Renaissance. Okay, so or Italian Renaissance, Southern or Italian Renaissance. Is Bellini did spend time in Flanders with the Flemish painters that we've already talked about, like with Van Eyck, just as one example, Jean Van Eyck, and he learned from these Flemish painters, and he was very much influenced. And this piece, Saint Francis in the Desert, um, is a rendering of influence from Flanders, and how it's influenced is he's using oil and tempera on wood. So he's mixing oil and tempera and he's putting it on wood. And before that, it was a lot of tempera with frescoes prior to this. And he's using the oil paint that he learned from the Flemish painters up north. And he's incorporating that. And Leonardo da Vinci is going to do that again during the high Renaissance. He'll pick up the oil paintings. A lot of people think Leonardo came up with the oil painting, but he did not. It was the Flemish painters that came up with the oil paints. Which again is just going to give more illumination, more brilliance, and longevity to the artwork. Okay, so that's what oil does, and plus it gives them more time to create, because oil paints take forever to dry unless you speed it up with a certain type of a solution or a solvent. Um, and plus you can use other things like linseed to give transparency to the oil, which allows you to layer it up and make it thicker and thicker, which is what Van Gogh is going to do with his impasto paintings. Is they're oil paintings and they're like 3 inches thick because he's able to do that with the new advents of oil. And he again is coming from a Flemish area, so is Rembrandt. Okay, so we'll get into that much later this semester. Another thing that he incorporated from the Flemish, is what's called horror vacui, Horrervacuii. Okay, it's Latin for like filling the space, filling the volume, or filling the vacuum. And that's something that the Southern or Italian Renaissance artists really were not that much about, filling up the space. It was more of a Northern European desire. So here we have Bellini deciding to take on that horror vacui, and filling the space, and be sure that it creates this composition where every corner of the piece is covered by some kind of biblical narrative. And there's a lot of symbolism in here. The first is he's being seen as a hermit, and he's separated from the city, and he's living out his life in this very rural, almost desertification environment, while the city activities are happening way in the background. But he's still part of that. The folks at this time also believed that Saint Francis was an incarnation of Moses. So there's a lot of elements in this narrative that show his connection to the biblical stories of Moses in Exodus. So there's different elements like the tree that's up in the top left corner waving down toward him as an indicator of the burning bush in Exodus, whenever God approaches himself to, or advents himself in this avatar within the bush to speak to Moses and tell him what he needs to do with Pharaoh and going back to Egypt to free the Israelites from the slavery in Egypt. So there's lots of symbolic elements. I'm not going to get into the specific biblical stories too much. That's something that you need to research yourself or take in a religious studies course. But do know that, again, we have symbolism here that reflects the Bible. And that was present in the Flemish painters as well. They used symbols, all right? The symbols were to reflect biblical as well as secular importances. Instead of speaking directly about the narrative, they would use a symbol to reflect maybe several stanzas that might come from a certain gospel or book in the Bible. All right, so that would be Exodus if you want to do the research on the symbolism. And again, he used color mannerisms by mixing tempera and oil. So by mixing the two together, you start to create what's called a manneristic style. And we're going to get into that at the end of chapter 22, talking about mannerisms, because Michelangelo is going to do the same thing, and it's going to shift attention towards mannerism and out of the Renaissance. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Okay, so we're going to jump to Mantegna in Mantua. So this is another area. And the figure that I want you to look at, this is another area in Italy, Southern Renaissance. And it's going to a figure 21.48. And it's the interior of the Camera Picta, painted chamber, Camera Picta. And again, we're in Mantua, and I'm showing you just some highlights in these different regions of Italy so that you don't think it's all about Florence. But Florence is influencing Venice, and it's influencing Mantua. And there are their own personal styles developing in these painters and these artists at this time too. But they are being heavily influenced by Flanders and also by the Florence as well as Flanders. Okay. Mantua, the area of Mantua of Italy, wanted to be like Florence and Venice, and also Rome, which would be the Papal States. We'll talk about more of the Papal States when we get into chapter 22. But they wanted to be more like those three areas. So they're their own region, their own province that's trying to rev up its own artistic flair. And Mantegna is the prominent painter artist during this time. And what's really cool, we just talked about Bellini, is that it's Bellini's brother-in-law. So Bellini's sister is married to Mantegna. So it's, again, a family thing. You have Bellini that was, we just looked at with a hermit of St. Francis, and he's in the desert, and he was the son of a prominent artist, and then he picked up his own style, and then he's working in tandem with his brother-in-law, Mantegna, in Mantua, Italy. So they both kind of knew each other very well. And one thing that we need to know about Mantegna in particular is that he's a master of foreshortening, F-O-R-E, shortening. And that is showing depth from foreground, middle ground to background, and giving extreme depth in these pieces. And we can see that in figure 21.48. Very quickly, to the far right, you have a whole bunch of individuals in red hats, probably signifying Mantua. And you can see it looks as if the vision of these figures are from the ground up. It's not eye level dimensionality of the figures. It is dimensionality from the feet up, as if they're at a diagonal, shifting into the architecture, as if you're laying on the ground and looking up at these figures. And that's what's called foreshortening, is whenever their upper features look as if they're receding into the background versus being on the same plane. Like if you're standing and standing right in front of someone and looking at them, they're all in the same plane. But if you lean back on the ground and look at them up at an angle, that's called foreshortening. And that's what he's doing with those figures with the red hats to the far right of figure 21.48. So be able to know that. And this Camera Picta is on the walls, like we see here with 21.48, but it's also on the ceiling, which will be 21.49, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. He's also incorporating the Greco-Roman use of the second style painting with real architecture mixed with the painted. So he's painting the architecture and having it transition into the actual architecture of the chamber. Okay, and that is characterized as the second style of Roman painting, all the way back in the Roman Empire, filling the space with a whole bunch of narratives and figures, and then painting the architecture as it transitions into the actual architecture of the building. So that's exactly what he's doing. So you should be able to see that. Like, again, refer to the figures in the red hats to the far right, figure 21.48, to see above one of them is painted architecture, and then it moves up into the ornamentation of the chamber ceiling, which is the actual architecture in and of itself. And where does that lead? That leads up to the painted ceiling, figure 21.49. And what he did is, instead of there being an actual opening or an oculus in the center of the chamber, which we saw with the Pantheon, he painted it. Okay? And you can see with the painting of the oculus, it gives it this sense of convexity, and the building is convex. It is the inner part of a dome, but he's opened it up, the architecture, where it looks like it's reaching out into the skies or into the heavens. And there's a whole bunch of cherubs or putti there that are foreshortened. You can see their tips of their toes, their little booties, and then moving up towards the crown, or the under chin and the eyes and their foreheads. That's the foreshortening used by Mantegna to give that element of depth and dimensionality. So he's doing the foreshortening with the painted oculus, as well, and the architecture that goes along with that circular architecture, as well as the cherubs or the putti, P-U-T-I, as well as the peacock that you see. Everything is foreshortened as if you're laying on the ground looking straight up. So that's the perspective he's trying to create, a perspective from below. Yeah, so those are examples to be able to see the foreshortening. And now let's look at another painting of his, so that this video isn't forever long. And that is going to be figure 21.50, foreshortened Christ, Lamentation over the Dead Christ. This is a perfect example of the foreshortening, with one exception. Well, first of all, the foreshortening, as you see, is from the feet foreground to the pelvic area, middle ground to the background, where his crown is and where his head is. And so this is what I mean by foreshortening, is trying to get the depth of the figure through that perspective, right? Like through that linear perspective, that rationalism of sight. And linear perspective creates this foreshortening. And here he is, instead of focusing on the linear perspective found in architecture, he's doing it within the body. And so he's converted that into the body to show you this depth of spatial recession of a figure laying on a bed. The one exception to the foreshortening here is that, according to all the art historians, is his feet are too small. His feet should be much bigger. Okay, if this was a true rendering of an individual laying on a table or on a bed, those feet would be so big it would cover up a lot of his lower body. So he's learning, okay, he's learning, but he's also choosing to do this, according to research, to show devotion to Christ, to Jesus, because by covering up his rest of his body with his feet, he loses a lot of the rendering of Christ, of Jesus. So he shortens the feet, he lessens the size of the feet so that there's more attention on the rest of his body. All right, so it was an intentional thing to show the devotion to the biblical tragedy, but he also wanted to incorporate the science of the natural perspective, even though he diminutized the feet so that you could see more of the science, and then also to see more of the devotion. So that's why he shrunk the feet. He's not going to be the only one who does stuff like this. We'll talk about Michelangelo, where he increased the hands and the feet of David for certain reasons. And so Mantegna is one of the first to actually explore this disproportionate placement to show devotion and to show more powerful presence of the figure, and in this case, the foreshortening of Christ, of Jesus. All right? So I'll leave you at that, and then we'll get marching into chapter 22.